Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Akbawlo Adeyeri and this is the Python Flask series. Now in this video we are going to learn about basic API structures using Python Flask. Now APIs are a very important part of the web now, making us able to separate our backend from the front end and actually interconnect each other using the JSON object. So let's learn how to make APIs using Python Flask. Now let's dive in and first create our main.py file, of course, main.py. But also let me create my virtual environment. So I'll say Python -m venv env. Okay, deactivate. I had a virtual environment active from before, so let me deactivate this first. Deactivate. Now let me recreate my virtual environment. So Python 3 -m venv and then env. Right, so now after using the JSON response inside of Flask means we are going to use some new packages actually. So let's try to see how this would go out. Now let me activate my virtual environment, source env bin, then activate. Okay, I spelled that wrong. Source. Right, now let me install Flask. Pip install Flask. Now there are two ways that we could use to make APIs inside of Flask. We could use the extension for the Restful API extension, and we could also use normal Flask like syntax. So let's try to use the first normal Flask, then we'll try to see what it's like to build an API using the Flask Restful API extension. So let's start. Let's create a basic REST API using Flask. Now of course I'll first import Flask. So from Flask import Flask. Now I will initialize my application. So let's say app equals Flask name, and now let's define a basic route. So at app.route, define index, and now just return. Now since we are going to be using APIs, we won't just be returning strings. We are going to be returning JSON like a JSON response, a JavaScript object notation. Now this is like basically like a dictionary that contains some specific data that we want to return. So instead of just returning some random text, let's simulate having a database in our web application, our web API, by just creating a basic variable here that we can just use for the meantime while our app is running. So this is just to simulate having a database, because we won't be going into that in this video. Let's just create a variable. Let me say users equals a list of users, and each user will be a dictionary. So now let's create a dictionary, and let's say name Alice, email Alice at gmail.com. let's say age, that equals 20. Right, let's add one more user. So let's say name. Right, I didn't have a comma after this, so that's why it's raising an error there. So now let's say name Jarvis. Right, email Jarvis at outlook.com, and age. So let's say Jarvis age, say 12, 16. Right, so now we have two users in our database as just for 6. Now we have two users that we can access using this variable, right? So let's try to return this user to the API response. So let's just say basically what instinctively come to mind is just returning the user object, right? Return users. But this, as it looks fine, it's not very nice. Let's try to run it and see what happens. But first let's add the if condition. So if name equals main, and then app.run. So debug equals true, of course. Debug equals true. Right, so let's try to run this and actually see what happens. So when I run Python main.py, initially it starts, but now let me visit this URL in my browser. So let me just go ahead and open this. Now we have, it's actually working fine. We have a JSON response because we returned the dictionary. So by default, Flask undo this as a JSON. So now you can see here we have all of the data that we have, like inside of the dictionary, is returned to the user. right, the age and the likes. But just for sakes, given that we are going to be returning like some types of data that might not be handled properly by Flask, it is recommended to use the jsonify package that is available like pre-installed in Flask. So I'll just go ahead and come here, import jsonify. Right now, after this, I'm just going to change this return users to jsonify users. So jsonify. Now jsonify is a function that takes in like any type of data, be it a string, a list, and changes into a JSON object that is now returned to the user. So now let's come back to my browser, reload, and see if there's any difference. Nothing really, because it's all the same. Now let's come back and now see how we can actually add some more features to this API. So being an API, we should be able to send different types of requests. Now by default, when we are visiting this URL in our browser, we are using the GET request. That's the default, right? So now when we come to my terminal here, you would notice in this part, in the logs, you would see we are using the GET keyword. That's because that's the method of this request that we are sending to the server. Now what if you want to handle different types of requests, like put? There are different types of requests. You have the put, you have the post, and a patch, like a bunch of others. So we could actually use multiple types of requests, because that's actually one of the features of the APIs, creating objects, updating, and deleting also. So like all of these, viewing and deleting, so all of these are features of the API. So we should be able to like add all these features to it. So let's try to make a post request in this route to enable us to add more users to this variable, right? So since it's not a database, of course, as soon as I restart my server, all of the changes that we made will disappear and it will get back to this too. But just for sake, let's try to see how that works. So I'll come here and say if request. So now to handle the different types of requests, I have to use the request object, right? But for now, we don't have anything like request objects in our Flask application. So let's go ahead and import that. So I'll say import request, right? And right from here, after importing request, what I want to do is now say if we had an if condition request, or just before that, actually, let me print the request method. So let's say print request method, right? So now after this, let's try to send a request using the post keyword. But now since we are using a browser, since we can't really send a post request using a browser by default, like sending a post request by entering the URL, but it's always defaulting to GET. So now we have to use like an API client. There are a bunch of API clients you can use to test and send requests to your APIs, but there are two popular ones that I actually use. I use Postman and also Thunder Client. You could use any of these two, and to get them, you just have to go to the extensions in your VS Code and search Postman. So when you search Postman, I actually spelled that wrong, Postman. Now you can see here we have Postman. So you just install this and then you have it like in your left sidebar of your VS Code. You can also search Thunder Clients. I'll be using that actually in this video. So Thunder Clients. You can also see that here. There are a bunch of other like different types that you could use for sending requests to your API clients. So now I'll just use Thunder Clients for this session. So now here you can see we have like this user interface that we can use to send requests. So of course I'll just click the new request, and now you can see here we can provide the URL of our API. We cannot define the method of our request, either using get, post, put, delete, patch, and a bunch of others. So now we can, by default, let me just provide my localhost port 5000. That's the URL that we have in this. So let me just go ahead and rerun my server again, right? So let me just copy this URL, http localhost, and paste it right here. Now when I click enter or just click the send button here, now you can see we have on this side the response. That is the same thing that we had in our browser, right? The age, the email, and the names and everything. So with this now we are able to send requests to our server and see the response in real time. So now you can see we have the name and everything. So now we can also send a post request, right? So let's click post instead. And now when we send the request, but before that, remember inside of our Python code, we printed the request method. So you can see here that we have the get. Now we send the request using the get request method. So now let me go back to the request and now change it to post and send again to see what actually happens. Now you can see here method not allowed. So it didn't actually run the function. Flask just decided that, okay, this method is not allowed. That's because we did not allow the method indeed inside of our code. By default, when you define a route, the default method is get. So until you change it or you allow different or other methods, that's when this will actually go through. So to do that, we have to do just say methods equals a list of values. So you can provide as many values as you want. If you want to undo 3 different types of requests, provide everything there. So now we can put get, but also we can now add one more post. Right, so now when I now restart my server and send the request using post, let's try this again. Send. Now you can see we have the same response, but now in the print we are now having post there instead. But also what happens when we remove the get, since this is default, right? When I remove this and I try to send a get request, that would also mean there will be an error saying method not allowed. So you just need to determine the types of requests that you want to use and how you want to send the request. So now let me go back and change this back to get and post. Now that we are able to check the type of requests that we are receiving, now it's time to actually undo those requests in order. So now let's check if request the method equals post. Now if it equals post, that means there's going to be like a JSON value, like if a data that is going to be sent to the server, so we can actually add it to the content of this list that we have here, the list of users. So now let's add this, but before that let's just try to print. Let's say print got a get post request actually. Right, so now when I try this again, restart my server and send a post request. Right, so now when I come here again, change this back to post and click send, now you can see got a post request. So now we've been able to undo things and actually perform actions if the method is a get, if it is a post request. Now let's go back to this and now begin to check how we can actually add data to the request. Now inside of this UI, inside of this user interface, you can actually see some things like query, headers, alt, body and the likes. For now, just leave all of this and let's just get to the body. So now inside of this body, we can begin to add things like a JSON. As you can see by default, this is JSON in like JSON formats. There are other formats like XML, text, form, encode and the likes. But for now, let's focus on the JSON because this is one that we are going to be using mostly inside of this section. So now let's try to add something like this. Create a JSON object which is going to be part of the request body that we are going to send to the server. So let me now add something like this. Let's say name John or James. Yeah, John. So John. Let me add one more for email. So let's say john@mail.com, and let's add for age. So let's say age equals 22. Right, so now when I send my request, it's still the same, nothing happens. But now let's try to get the contents of this body using our API in the post part of the function. So now let's remove this. Now we can say user equals, or let's say data actually. So data equals request .json. Now by default, request.json is going to be like implement, it's already there. It's going to be a variable that we have, request.json, since we sent this request as a JSON object. Now when I come back to my server, restart it again, and now see when I send my request. Now when I click this send here, still nothing happens. But now let's try to find out why that is. Right, I just created a variable, I never printed it. So now let me print the contents of this data. Print data. Now when I send the request again, let's see what happens. Print. Right, now you can see the data that I sent to the API using the request, the post request. Now we have the name, email and everything. So now let's try to add the contents of this data that we got from the request to the variable. So let's say users do append data, right? And now let's return jsonify message user added. Right, so now let's try to send the request again and see what happens. Now we've appended the contents of the request to the user object. Now let's send the request again and let's see what happens. Now you can see user added. That's the response we had, right? But now what also happens when we now go back to this post and change it to get? You know, now since we've been able to add the content of this user to the request to the users object. Now when I send this, it should now be showing me 3 users. Right, now you can see we have the John user there also. Now when I change this back to post, let me try to add one more user. Change this to and right, now when I send the request again, you can see also here user added. Right, now when I change this back to get, also that would have been added to my variable. Now we have, so right, this is working fine. Now we have a simple API here going using the normal Flask system. Right, so now let's come back here. But now, as I said, of course, since we are using a variable and not a database, as soon as I restart my server, this will be completely gone. So let me send the request again. Now we are back to the 2 because it's a variable. It only stays in memory. So now that's that about that. We also, of course, we can use different types of requests. We can say patch, put, and the like. So just you can go ahead and experiment with that. We'll just leave it at this for now. And now let's try to use the Flask Restful extension to create a REST framework application. Now let's go ahead and create a new file for that purpose. Let me create one more file in my lecture 3. Let's say restful.py. Now inside of this restful.py, we are going to implement the exact same thing that we have here inside of the main.py. But instead of using the jsonify stuff, we're going to be using the Flask RESTful API extension. So let me just go ahead and import all of this. I would actually be removing some of the import lines. So let me just come here, remove the jsonify because we won't be needing that. Let me actually restart cancel my server. Just close this for now. So now I'll just go ahead and import a few more things that we could use for the Flask RESTful. Right. Now, of course, the Flask RESTful is like an entire package on its own. So we of course have to install it before we begin to use it. So now let's get to that. Let's say inside of our terminal, pip install Flask RESTful. Now after this is installed, then we'll go ahead and import it and actually use it inside of. As you can see, it also has some requirements that are already like met using Flask and the like. So if by default you don't have Flask installed and you install Flask RESTful, it automatically install Flask for you because that's one of the dependencies. Let me just go ahead and close this now since we've imported we've installed the Flask RESTful. So now I'll just go ahead and import it here. So from Flask RESTful import resource and API. So this resource and API are classes that we could use to actually create our own RESTful API. But this should actually not be showing these squiggly lines because that's saying it's not resolved. But I guess that's because it's not reading my current virtual environment. So I'll go ahead and switch that currently Python 3 interpreter path global. Let me just leave this actually. Escape. So now let me go ahead and create the API using the Flask RESTful API part. Right, so now let me come back here, create. Now it follows the same structure that we have, but now we need to add a few things because now we are using the API instead of just the application. Now let's create an API variable, set it to an API. Now remember we are using this API, right, that we imported from Flask. Now this API helps us to create like an API instance that automates the response stuff. Now we are going to be passing an argument of the application, of course, because we need to use the routes and the likes. Now after that, let's create the variable users. Let me just go ahead and copy that from here, create the users variable, copy, come here and paste. Now okay, now for the resource, we're going to be using that to create the actual endpoint. So let's create class user that would actually inherit from the resource. Def get self. Now it's going to look a little different because of course we are now using an extension, not just the Flask. Return users. Right. So now since we are using the Flask Restful, we don't need to worry about the JSONify stuff and the likes, because that's handled by the Flask Restful package. So now let's try to send a request now and see actually what happens. But before that, since we are using since we didn't create any route right now, so we have to now link this endpoints that we created, which is using a class for the resource. We have to link this to a route. So now we can just say API dot add resource user. So now this means we are now mounting this resource, we are mounting these endpoints to the default route. Now this means whenever we visit our local hotspot 5000, we should be able to access the contents of this API and the users variable. Now let's add of course our if condition, if __ name equals main. Now we'd have our app.run and then debug equals true. Now let's start this and actually see what happens. But instead of running python main.py, now we'll be running python restful.py. Now let's send a request. Let's send a get request actually. If I try to send a post request, that of course would not work because we've not handled a post currently. So now here you can see message, this is not allowed for it. As you can see now, this is actually much more looking like an API, because we don't just get the random HTML response that we're getting for method not allowed that we're getting in previous Flask application. But now since we are using Flask Restful, it automatically like changes this to a JSON response that okay, this method is not allowed for the requested URL. Now when I change this to get, now see what happens. We have the same response for the user's object. So that this is working exactly the same, just I would say it's just a little bit easier to use, given that most of these things are already implemented for us using the Flask Restful API. Now as I said, we are using the get method here because, as I say, it's really a method actually. Since we have a function that is inside of a class, it's called a method. So any name that goes along with this is going to be the method of the URL. Now when I come back here and create a def post, that means I'm now allowing the post request inside of this URL. Now let's just go ahead and do the exact same thing. Data equals request.json users are append, like the same thing we had in the previous one. And now this time we'll be returning user added. So now when I try to send a post request now, of course that would work exactly fine because now we've allowed the post request. Now we still have the get working fine, but now when I change it to post, this would also work fine. Right, send, right, user added, but now when I change it back to get, that would also work because now it has added to the variable. So this is working fine now. So you can also add like different other like options, request options, like changing, adding, puts and the likes. So let's also try just def put. Now this is what the put request, of course. Now let me just print. We're not doing anything. Let me just print got a, or just return, instead of that, just return a put request was sent. Return message got a put request. Now when I restart my server, I can now send a put request and this will work fine. Got a put request. Now of course each of the requests have their own purposes. Like get is to get read content from the API, post is to create a new object, put is to like update an object, delete is to delete an object, patch and the like. So they all have their own purposes and their own like ideas behind them. So just we can now use a put request. But now when I try to use delete, of course that would not work fine because the method is not allowed. And now this is how to create a simple REST framework API inside of Flask using the Flask Restful package. But before we continue, just if you've enjoyed the video so far, please like the video, subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Now let's just try to understand why we use a virtual environment really in this case, because now we begin to install Flask Restful and other packages like Flask and Flask Restful. But when we begin to use databases and the likes, we'll actually be using a lot of packages. Now we can actually use the pip freeze command to now determine all of the packages that we used for this project. Here you can see all of the Flask Restful, and every other thing that is dependent for this project to run. Now we can actually save this into a file, so we can actually upload this to GitHub. Whenever anyone wants to run our project, they just install this. So let me just go ahead and run pip freeze requirements .txt. And of course I'm going to be pushing this code to GitHub, so you can just check the description of this video or the URL for the pinned comments of the URL to the GitHub repository where this code is going to be available. So you can just go ahead and go there and check the code if you're having any issues with yours, and of course leave any questions if you are encountering any errors with this. So thanks so much for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to my channel for more. Goodbye everyone.